John Boyd.
Alexander Horn, great to be here with you.
Great to be here with you.
Episode number 8 of Behind the Books from IVP Academic. Can you believe it?
I can. It's been a journey and a really good one.
Yeah, we have Nijay Gupta interviewing Dennis Edwards in this week's episode, and this is a fascinating conversation.
Mm-hmm. They touch on a lot of different topics, from Dennis Edwards' kind of scholarship in early life and early studies to his pastoral ministry and then his contributions to the DPL2.
Yeah, he's a fascinating contributor. Like so many other contributors to the Dictionary of Paul and his letters, second edition, he's an author in his own right. We actually have a relatively new book within the last year by Dennis called Humility Illuminated. And this is just an index of the riches that are found in the DPL2 that people who are busy working on book length projects have turned their efforts, turned their skills to contributing articles to this dictionary. In Dennis's case, it's 3 different articles on African-American interpretation, on preaching Paul today, and on slavery. And those 3 contributions are just the tip of the iceberg of the rest of Dennis's scholarship.
One of the things that I loved about this episode and Nijay's engagement with Dennis is Nijay mentioned that in reading Esau Macaulay's Reading While Black, it was kind of the first time he was engaging with African-American interpretation and breaking a little bit of the belief that African-American interpretation was only for African-Americans.
Yeah, they've got a great conversation here about how the whole church needs to listen to contextual interpretation from communities all over the place, including Black readers and those who have a community orientation and a pastoral orientation, as Dennis's New Testament scholarship does. He's interested in the theory and the abstract stuff and the theology, the ideas, but he really wants to see, how does this work out for us in our communities, and are we living out the faith? It's something that comes through in this conversation.
Yeah, and there's a depth of richness and interpretation and truth that can come from different perspectives that may not come from others in a specifically socially located interpretation.
Right.
Listen in, Nijay Gupta interviewing Dennis Edwards.
Dennis, it's so fun to be able to have this chat with you. I want to start out by describing a person to you. This person wears many hats: pastor, professor, scholar, dean, denominational leader, father, husband, and saxophone player. Could these all be describing one person?
Well, those things are true of me to some degree or another, yes.
So delighted to chat with you on Behind the Books, and we'll eventually be getting to your contributions to the Dictionary of Paul and his letters. But, looking at you and listening to you talk, I am just reminiscent of our early days after our PhD and sitting at, a luncheon at SBL. And I remember you and I would try to get our pictures taken with the famous scholars, the Craig Keeners and the N.T. Wrights of the day. Dennis, would you just take us back to your younger years and the journey that led you to getting a PhD in New Testament studies?
Sure. I mean, I am a product of New York City schools and church, and I was just curious. I wanted to know the Bible well. I think about those words in Timothy, to make every effort, or the old King James, study to show yourself approved, the worker that doesn't need to be ashamed, rightly dividing. I always wanted to rightly divide the word, so that was something I was trying to do even as a young guy. I mean, young, like late teens into my 20s, and then eventually went to seminary. But even after seminary, as a young pastor, I thought, oh my goodness, I want to be really good at this. And it was more not even thinking about teaching at a seminary or anything. It was just, I wanted to be a good exegete. I wanted to be confident of what I was doing. So I started working on a doctorate, and it took me a long time. I mean, I didn't have much money. I didn't have opportunity to go away and study and do it, say in Europe or something. So I stayed in Washington, D.C., where I was ministering at the time. And I started a program that I had originally started in New York at Fordham, but I had to restart in DC at the Catholic University, and took me altogether, Fordham and Catholic, altogether about 9 years. So I was one of those people that just plugged away. But yeah, it was all because I just had a hunger to understand the scriptures better.
I don't know, how much people know from the writings that you do, because you're all over the map. We'll talk about that, and I appreciate that about you. But I don't know if people will know what your dissertation was about. You and I have had some private conversations. Would you just tell us a little bit about how you came to decide on what you studied? I remember being so stressed out
Yes.
in my kind of late seminary days, early PhD on, this is when the movie A Beautiful Mind came out, where you had this, this genius who had such a hard time landing on kind of this world-changing idea. So I felt that pressure, like I had to come up with this idea. I know that that's hard for a lot of students. What topic were you interested in? What did you decide to study for your dissertation?
Oh my goodness. Well, that I was interested in issues related to justice because I had been a pastor in New York, and then at that time in Washington, D.C. But I didn't really know what to study. And the late Joseph Fitzmyer was one of my instructors I had for many New Testament classes. I made an appointment to talk with him about it. But I also, he didn't want to direct any dissertations, but he was willing to be a reader on them. So I just asked for his advice on some things. But I also, I know it sounds kind of silly, but I was a pragmatist too. I didn't want to do it in Pauline studies. I felt like there was so many people working in Paul and so much secondary literature that at this stage in my life, I just wanted to be done. So this was around the year 2000. So yeah, about 24 years ago. And I was attracted to the Epistle of James. So I did my work in James. At the time, and maybe still, people were debating, does James have any coherent structure, or is it just some random words of wisdom, the paranesis and that people would talk about? So I thought it did have a coherent structure. My dissertation is called A Reviving Faith, an Eschatological Understanding of James 5:13 through 20, the last section there. But because I was in a rush to be done, I never published it. I was just happy to be done. And I didn't even think I was going to be a teacher. Like I said, I was just happy to be done. And I stayed in my little church, serving the church in Washington, D.C., until I started getting a whole bunch of adjunct teaching opportunities. But yeah, it was in James, and I still am drawn to the Catholic epistles throughout my career.
Well, you're in good company with Professor N.T. Wright, who also didn't publish his dissertation. So
okay,
maybe it's a prestige thing.
Well, I
Dennis.
didn't know that. I knew that was true of our friend Michael Gorman, but he just got his published last year.
Okay, so maybe you're on the 30-year track.
I mean, it was a thing that years ago that people didn't. I don't know why, but yeah, and that was just 24 years ago.
Well, there's a little bit, kind of ironically, you ended up writing several articles for the Dictionary of Paul and his letters. We'll come back to that in a moment. But you did your dissertation on James. You wrote a wonderful commentary on 1 Peter that I've used as a textbook with my students. I know that you are doing some work in the Johannine literature.
Thank you. Yes.
There is kind of a dividing line between Catholic epistle scholars and Pauline scholars and gospel scholars. There are these kind of silos that we sometimes work in. You've managed to do some crossover work. We'll talk about that later. But in terms of your interest in the Catholic epistles, the general letters, is there something that draws you to these? Is it just opportunity, or is there a deeper story there?
Well, it first was just opportunity. It was a matter of, like I said, being done and not having to wade through, mountains of secondary literature on Paul. Although it's still intriguing, I still, find myself drawn to some Pauline things. I felt like the Catholic epistles are overlooked to a large degree. So I just wanted to help bring them to light, to help people get into them and see what they have to say to the churches, especially since we don't know that much about the original communities that received these letters. So it's even more intriguing. Maybe it's even more general in that sense that they can have some word for us today. So yeah, I feel like they're underutilized and not known as well. So I want to help bring them to the light.
Yeah, I wonder too if maybe your interest in justice, if I'm looking at a theme in a lot of your work, maybe with James's interest in dynamics of wealth, 1 Peter and some issues there with suffering,
yes,
and righteous suffering, and maybe even the household codes to some degree, get you into questions about justice. So let's just shift to Paul for a minute. Before some of your more recent work on Paul, for example, on Philemon, which we'll talk about in a second, you've written a couple general books. You've written several general books, but a couple of them are Might from the Margins, which I really love. And more recently, Humility Illuminated. I kind of feel like you're coming into Paul Not through the front door. You're kind of climbing a window in the back.
I think there's truth to that. And maybe it's because of the pastoral hats I've worn over the years, because so many of our communities are shaped by Pauline literature and the way we do church, the way we think about church and stuff. So yeah, you're right. It sort of came through the back door, more of my Pauline experience. I once served the church for about 6 years in Washington, D.C. before I was a church planter. And I joked about how young preachers, particularly maybe evangelical preachers, they run to Paul's stuff and I have my finger pointing like they're ready to tell everybody what to do. And I realized that church, I had never done a series of messages from a Pauline book over in 6 years. I had focused mostly on Old Testament passages and books that I didn't think people would know. Like I did a whole series in Haggai, a whole series in Hosea, stuff like that. So for me, it was not avoiding Paul. It was more bringing other things to the light. But yes, you're right. I sort of came in the back door in the academic sense of looking at Pauline scholarship that way.
I think that's really refreshing because even though I've, focused my career in my research on Paul, I think we both see Paul differently than sort of the traditional perspective on Paul. I think a lot of traditional Pauline scholars are interested in justification by faith or some of the combative doctrines,
right?
That sort of thing. And, you've mentioned your background in ministry, your passion in ministry. You actually wrote an article for the Dictionary of Pauline Letters on preaching and interacting with Paul today. And you say a couple of things in there I want to follow up on. One thing is the challenges of preaching itself. You've spent a lot of time in your career preaching. And I remember in seminary having this experience where I was taking Introduction to Preaching at the same time as I was taking exegesis of 1 Corinthians.
Oh.
And so I felt this kind of dissonance because in the preaching class, it was focused mostly on delivery and performance and rhetoric, all good things related to communication.
That's right.
But then in 1 Corinthians, we're just getting hammered with the wisdom of the cross, not the wisdom of eloquence, all this kind of stuff. How do you interpret and appreciate what 1 Corinthians has to say to preachers dealing with this, this kind of struggle of truth, but also wanting to convey truth winsomely, that sort of thing? You talk about this in your article. It's a great essay.
Well, I do appreciate that, Nijay. I say, it was the saying years ago, all politics is local. I jokingly say all preaching is local because we have this sense that maybe we've modeled ourselves after some big name speakers, or we've gone to these conferences and kind of get wowed by people who are really eloquent and such. And in some sense, okay, that's cool. Maybe we learn a few things. But the reality is people in congregations are going to connect with pastors and preachers because of who they are, not just how well they communicate in the pulpit. Because you could be really eloquent and then be a jerk, and people will find that out and they'll start to leave. Unless there's, some other dysfunctions going on, but the point is I see preaching as much more than that, 20, 30, 40-minute thing that goes on a Sunday morning. I see it as more engaging the community. So for me, that's where the Pauline stuff it's not about eloquence. I came preach the cross. I came not with words of wisdom, but I came with a demonstration of the Spirit. I mean, I think those are the things that come to play. It's not to say that we just wing it up there and don't prepare, but it is to say I try not to stress so much on how articulate or cool or, flashy I can be in the pulpit. There was a time when that bothered me. I mean, I wanted to be like the cool preachers, and I wanted to have people come away saying, wow, wasn't that awesome? And I followed some awesome preachers at certain events, and I realized, you know what? I don't really need to compete with that. I just want to be the best Dennis I can be. And I feel like that's a Pauline way of being. He's going to bring himself, like he says in 1 Thessalonians, which I think is one of the earliest letters. And he says that he came as a parent, right? You did all that technical work on 1 Thessalonians, So it's parental, it's nurturing, it's sharing, he says, not just the gospel, but our whole lives. So for me, that's pastoral ministry. That's preaching.
Yeah, I was going to mention this. You got there first. One of your main points in your essay is Paul helps model the life of the pastor. I'm not going to say that's controversial, but I think it's only really in the last 40, 50 years that we have talked about Paul as a pastor.
Yeah.
And maybe scholarship like Eugene Peterson, Brian Rosner, and others who've made this sort of emphasis. Obviously, Paul is not technically called a pastor, or nobody is, in my opinion, in the New Testament. But what do you mean when you compare Paul to a pastor? What are you trying to say, and what does he actually show us in his ministry that's helpful for pastors?
Yeah, thank you for that assessment. I think our friend Scott McKnight has done that too, right? And made those connections. I think at the very, let's say, simplest way of it is caring for communities of faith, right? So when he says in 2 Corinthians about all the stresses that he went through and all the hardships and the shipwrecks and all the difficulty, he goes, and his day-to-day care for the churches, that's in that list, and there's this sense that true shepherds, true pastors are caring about communities of faith. So if we think about the letters in that way, right, the community-centered ones like a 1 Corinthians you mentioned, or even I guess it's somewhat of a personal letter, the Philemon one, but gets read to a community. These are pastoral in the sense that they're addressing communities of faith. They're not edicts from on high somewhere. So that's what I mean.
Yeah. I don't know if people will notice this because it's not super obvious, but you're kind of an InterVarsity Press poster child. Because you published Humility Illuminated, you've contributed to the Dictionary of Paul and his letters, and the IVP New Testament in Color. Now, when we recorded this episode, the book New Testament Color is not published yet. But I had the privilege of getting your portion early because I'm also working on Philemon.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so I've read your work on Philemon. I know this is an interest of yours, and you continue to develop this interest. I feel like there is kind of a trend of minoritized scholars like myself and yourself taking interest in Paul's letter to Philemon. I think there's maybe even a little bit more interest for African-American scholars because of the history of slavery.
Right.
And you look at scholars like Callahan and Williams and others who have contributed much to this. I'll be honest with you, when I was in seminary, I can't even remember a lecture from a professor on Philemon.
Same.
And I'm doing work right now on Philemon, and the big message throughout Western history, it's not theological. There's nothing really theological about Philemon. And there were even debates in the early church about whether it should really be included in the canon because of how it just deals with this little worldly thing between, a master and a slave. But even in your work with New Testament in Color, you're bringing to the conversation an interest in something you wrote for in the Dictionary of Paul's letters, African-American interpretation, and you wrote the essay entry on slavery, I believe.
Yes.
And tell us how your pitch for why Philemon is actually a very important text in the New Testament, despite its brevity, despite the fact it doesn't have a Christ hymn, and it doesn't have overt statements about eschatology or the afterlife or anything like that. What's your best case for why this is an urgent theological text that we need to give more attention to in our age?
Wow. My best case, I'm an introvert, so I have to process that to get my best case. But I'll give you a case,
A case.
No, I mean, the word, koinonia shows up in there, and there's a sense of community life that might be behind that text in a way that I think is theological, the way we live out our faith or the way that we, express it in the day-to-day, in the relationships. That's a heavily theological enterprise. So our society, and maybe some segments of our society, have been more interested in sort of propositional statements, things like justification by faith and trying to define those things, and not as interested in some of the ethical implications of those things. Philemon is a nice text in that we know some of Paul's thinking from other letters like Romans or Philippians or something. And to see this pastoral part also present says that we can't just reduce the Christian faith to some propositions like we might have tried to do with Romans, but fortunately not stopping there. But we are seeing how the faith is vital in the lives of community members. So that was long, a little bit meandering, but I guess the point is there's a practicality to that letter that has the things that we might name as theological, like salvation and justification, they're in the background in a way, but in the foreground is, what does this mean for this community? How are they living their lives? That to me is deeply important.
Yeah, absolutely. There is history. I've been just digging into this in my own research, a long, long history of assumptions of misbehavior on the part of Onesimus, the slave, going back to Ambrosiaster and Chrysostom. And there's a narrative that's created of Onesimus, the thieving fugitive slave. And that persisted for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years until about the middle of the 20th century. And the work of scholars like Sarah Winter and Callahan, who actually utilized, Callahan specifically utilizing, to some degree, African-American interpretation to say, have we just made assumptions about Onesimus that we can't prove that follow certain cultural stereotypes?
That's right. That's right.
That are really dangerous. And Callahan opened up some other interpretive lenses, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And we're actually seeing a bit of a sea change in Philemon scholarship just in the last 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
Where the narrative of the fugitive, the thieving fugitive slave is not, it may still be popular, maybe 50, 60%, but it's not the dominant by far.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think part of this is the benefits of African-American biblical interpretation.
I agree.
And you wrote on this for the dictionary. Let me take you, Dennis, back to my seminary days. I went to Gordon Conwell. I had a wonderful experience there, but in my hermeneutics class, and this may just be the late 90s, early 2000s, but we were in evangelical seminaries, because I know you went to a similar seminary.
Yeah.
We were taught the most important thing about hermeneutics is objective, historical, grammatical study, which means ancient context and Bible works. Right? Ancient context. That's all you need. That's all you need. And those things are important.
For sure.
Those things are valuable. But I think if I had read a book on any kind of location-oriented or culture-oriented interpretation, it would be really strongly poo-pooed.
Yes.
At the seminary I went to, because it would be seen as liberal. It would be seen as loosey-goosey, presupposition.
Right.
And so I took that to heart. And I just thought, okay, those things are for other people. They're not for me.
Yeah.
And then the original Dictionary of Paul's Letters didn't even have these types of essays on Asian American interpretation, African American, Latinamente, that sort of thing.
Right.
Do you resonate with my experience that 20, 25 years ago, this was strongly discouraged in evangelical circles, or at the very least just ignored to our detriment? What is the progression of your experience with this? Is it similar to mine?
Definitely similar. I think that was one of the things that made seminary difficult for me, because I had a certain feeling or instinct or frame of reference because of who I am, but I could not find anybody who shared that or could affirm it in any way. In fact, I found the opposite. I found there were some professors who straight out made things difficult for me for even bringing up a different viewpoint or a lens from my, cultural background. In other words, what I brought as an African American was dismissed by some faculty members. So I thought maybe I'm just wrong. Maybe I don't understand this Christian thing as well as I thought I had, but I didn't have hardly anyone to bounce my ideas off of. So it wasn't, I think that's probably another reason why I pursued doctoral studies, because I thought maybe I'm missing something and I need to learn some more, And it wasn't until after seminary I became freer in trusting some of the questions that I brought to the text and questions that other people brought to the text. So yes, is the quick answer. Yeah, for me, it's been more like 35 years since seminary. And I've definitely seen a movement among Christian scholarship to accept the notion of social location, to even affirm it, to try to understand better. But yeah, I was like you. I did not have that taught in seminary, and it was discouraged even.
I think part of this may be just who our professors were. I don't fault my professors for who they were, but I didn't have any African American professors in seminary as far as I can remember. I personally didn't have any Asian professors, even though there were some teaching at our seminary. So the embodiment wasn't there, which usually leads to acceptability. The acceptability
that's a good
comes with
point.
embodiment, right?
Good point.
And exposure to those kinds of, and also some seminaries, mine wasn't so much, but can be kind of watchdog, so you're kind of afraid to introduce ideas, that sort of thing.
Oh yeah, you got constituents to please.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But, what's interesting is I think we're at a place in scholarship where we're recognizing we can't separate out who we are
Mm-hmm.
from the interpretive process, and we really shouldn't either.
Yeah, well, when theological interpretation was getting talked about a lot, we can't sort of separate our formational kind of identity, our spiritual formational identity, and maybe even our ecclesial kind of connections. That's part of, the interpretive process for some people, even though there's probably no real clear definition of theological interpretation, but it seems to hit at those things, right? How you've been shaped and formed is part of your approach to some texts. So that seemed like that kind of thinking was opening a door for us to bring our whole selves to the process. But you're right, it wasn't encouraged, and I found it to be, it wasn't modeled. I didn't have any African-American seminary well, let's just say it the other way. All my Bible and theology professors were white men. It wasn't like I necessarily expected it to be different, but I didn't know that it meant I was going to be discouraged in my own, identity. And I didn't hear many women's voices, so it was problematic in that regard. But my education continued because I could keep a cloud over that time. And even though it was frustrating to me, my education continued. But it did mean that I had to hunt out and find those voices.
I feel a little embarrassed to say this, but my first major kind of foray into African-American interpretation was Esau McCaulley's book, Reading While Black. And before I read that, I had thought, and this was mistaken, but I had thought African-American interpretation was for African-Americans. And one of the things that Esau does so well in his book is show that everyone can benefit from this.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody should be reading, specimens of African-American interpretation. For those that are listening who are resonating with what you're saying, but they don't really understand the benefits and values of a non-African-American reading and appreciating African-American biblical interpretation, in just a minute, can you just explain a little about what it is and how everyone can benefit from it, the same way we can benefit from feminist hermeneutics and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think there are a few things that come into play when we talk about African-American biblical interpretation. It's sort of our view of God. It's our historical experience in this country. And it's our expectation of seeing ourselves in the text in a way that we had not before. We almost always assume the people in the text are white when we don't know if there's any white people in the text, right?
Yeah,
but
that's a good point.
Yeah, right. So there's this sense that African-American interpretation is shining a lens on things that were important or are still important for African-Americans based on our experience and our understanding of God. So, the quintessential example, of course, is the Exodus story of a God who rescues people from slavery. That's maybe a trope now, but that is a helpful kind of picture that if we see God as liberator, that helps to influence how we think about God in other biblical texts, right? I would say the other part of your question about it helpful for everyone, I think it is helpful for everyone, but I'll confess that for me personally, it has been, talking about African-American biblical interpretation, I've really had quite a focus on trying to get other African-American people to understand that this is a legitimate way to read the text, because I want to see more of me. I want to see younger folks who also want to pursue church work or scholarly work who can find themselves in the academy. And I am seeing more of that, but because my story pretty well, Nijay, and we mentioned Esau, which is great. Esau is 20 years younger than I am, and so 20 years ago there were very few African Americans doing biblical studies in the academy. Certainly in evangelical adjacent spaces, there were very few, if at all, in biblical studies and say theology. So for me, part of what I'm trying to model is something that I want catch on for younger folks too, younger African Americans.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I reread your DPL entry and appreciate the historic African American interpretive importance of justice, liberation, and truth, and how reading the Bible through these stories throughout time and throughout space can, just like you said, create a different lens.
Yes.
through which that we could see Scripture. I think of a book, I think it was Reggie Williams, Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. Did you ever read that book?
Yes. I have it, but I haven't finished it.
Harlem
So-
Renaissance Theology and Ethic of Resistance. And I'm a huge Bonhoeffer nut. I
Oh,
love
okay.
Bonhoeffer. And I always tell my students how transformative it was for him to have this experience in the United States during this, what Williams calls Harlem Renaissance.
Mm-hmm.
And he's in these Black churches where there are these Black Christians who are identifying with Jesus, who was criminalized and persecuted and who suffered, and yet, is a savior to those who come to him, and how Bonhoeffer could go back into his world in Germany and bring that perspective to bear on what was going on. I think about that as a helpful lens through which to communicate the values of looking at the so-called Black struggle.
Yeah.
Last question, Dennis. Thanks so much for these very important insights and comments. It can be a temptation when you're doing so much intensive study of Scripture with all these critical tools. It can be a temptation to grow cynical. And I've seen this in various scholars where you start your career kind of gung-ho for Jesus or, really positive spirit, and then you read all this stuff. And as an academic, your job is to take the knife and to cut, and slice. And I think if you're not careful about, your heart and your soul, I think it's a temptation for academics to become cynical. I think with your background in pastoral ministry, you've probably learned some of these lessons earlier in life with just the challenges you face as a Black scholar in a mostly white world. I feel like you probably have some wisdom to share on how to be critical without giving in to cynicism. How have you navigated that throughout your pastoral ministry, but especially now your academic career, as you seek to continue to want to mentor the next generation?
Yeah, no, that's a rich question. It's interesting. If there is any cynicism on my part, it's more about how churches in America have been than it is about the scholarly world.
Yeah, it could be a respite to be in the academic world. There's clear rules.
That's actually been true for me. It's sort of like in the academic world, I use the tools and I can get away from some of the baggage, of some of the way Christianity is performed, in our culture. But you do raise a point. I do think that it's like you're taking the curtain off of things, and you're looking at it more closely when you're looking at the biblical text, or you're looking at the history of Christianity or something like that. And you're saying to yourself, oh my goodness, I was taught something maybe in a naive way, and now I'm seeing things more closely. That could lead to a cynicism. I think the thing that helps me in that is, I'll confess, I've been cynical about some things, but my overall kind of perspective is really shaped by the fact that I like to stay involved in faith communities, because it helps me to see how people are wrestling with real life and things. So it's not an abstract exercise, for me, where I can get cynical and hypercritical. It's more like, oh, this means stuff to people. And I want to keep staying in that world, being involved in a church or active in some aspect of practical ministry, because that helps me to be less cynical about all of this.
Yeah, it sounds like staying grounded is really important. Yeah, and thinking kind of, what's the point of all this?
Yeah, exactly. That's actually a good way to say it. What's the point of all of this?
I love that.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, we are so thankful for how you have applied your wisdom and your scholarship to benefit the Academy and the church. Thanks so much for your time, Dennis.
Thank you, Nijay. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Behind the Books from IVP Academic.
Join us next week when Scott McKnight chats with contributor Lucy Pepiot.
Behind the Books is a production of IVP Academic. For more information on any IVP titles mentioned in this episode, visit ivpress.com and use code IVPOD25. That's IVPOD25 for 25% off. Sound engineering by Honest Podcasts. Our producers are Alexandra Horn and Travis Alberton. Our production assistants are Christine Felicio Mello and Jack Reese. Our hosts are Scott McKnight, Lynn Kohik, Nijay Gupta, John Boyd, and Alexandra Horn. Don't forget to subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts, and leave a rating and review to support the show.